So this is perfect. Now I'm gonna cut this into shorts and post only this for the rest of eternity and say, look, you need soft skills. That is your differentiator. You need to do this. How might a PhD in economics help you out as a software engineer? Well, probably in some ways that you're not expecting. Hi, my name's Nick Cosentino, and I'm a principal software engineering manager at Microsoft. In this video, I was joined by John Vandivier of Latterly.io, who is a PhD in economics. John has put together an approach for skilling up as a software engineer that is entirely evidence and data based. There's a lot of really interesting overlap for how John likes to approach skilling up software engineers and how I like to educate and share my experience for engineers as well. It was great that John could support his claims with data and research as well. So if you're an aspiring software engineer or looking to skill up as a software engineer, this video is going to be awesome for you. A quick reminder to subscribe to the channel and check out that pinned comment for my courses on Dome Train. All right, sit back, enjoy. I'll see you next time.
Right, so it was originally my TikTok. My name's John Vandivier, senior software engineer, about 10 years of experience. I also have a PhD in economics.
Which is so cool.
Because my sister said it was cool. And she showed me some funny videos and said, "You're so old, why don't you have a TikTok yet? Don't you want to be cool?" And I thought, well, yes, of course. And so I played a bit of guitar, and I just did sort of random things until I was just giving a hot take related to something to do with tech. I don't remember what it was. But you remember a few years ago, there was just a wave of like trend in the States of people wanting to get into tech. And I guess I hit it at the right time, and it resonated with a bunch of people. And I thought, whoa, let me stick to this topic because it's actually performing for me. And right. I went from a couple hundred followers to tens of thousands of followers because I found a niche where I was providing value, people cared. And on TikTok, when you get to 1,000 viewers, you're able to live stream.
And that's what I'm pushing for, yeah.
Yeah, I hope you get it. I'll do what I can to help you. That was a big,
thank you.
That was a big milestone for me. When I was able to cross that, then I was able to get a lot more viewers because I'm able to effectively communicate programming when I'm streaming, I think better than in these short form videos.
Which is awesome, right? Because and that's actually some of the feedback I get on some of my content. So for a lot of my, if people watch my content and it's short form, it is almost never an original short form piece. And full transparency, it takes too much time for me to dedicate to that versus focusing on my main type of content. So I've had feedback where people have said, hey, why didn't you post the whole thing? And I'm like, well, it's a short. And if you want the whole thing, here's the link to the YouTube video kind of thing. But it's really cool that you're able to kind of lean into the streaming. And like you said a little bit before, the fact that your jam is really that you stream this stuff, and that's kind of like where you're creating all of your original value. I think that's super cool and a whole unique skill set, because I feel like a lot of people coding and streaming, that's not easy. It's like people doing a software demo and it's like nothing ever works in a demo, and here you are writing the code and to a live audience.
It is a skill. It's a skill that I've acquired, and I'm not exactly sure how I acquired it, and I don't fully appreciate it myself. Interviewing.io just today, I think, released a blog article where they studied the skill sets of top engineers and where they work. So okay. Interviewing.io, you may know, is a job search preparation platform. So you can book a interview with a real FANG engineer, and they'll run you through a full loop, and they'll give you transparent feedback, which is nice. Cool. One of those things that's kind of missing, if you do the actual loop, you might not get decent feedback, right? So you pay interviewing.io. Anyway, in any case, they have a really nice blog where they're constantly releasing analyses of their own interviews.
Ah.
And one of the things that they found, which was surprising to me, here's something that's not surprising. Okay, Dropbox engineers excel at coding rounds, right? So your classic big tech engineers are going to succeed at the coding rounds. One thing I was surprised by is that the number 2 best communicators were Capital One engineers. And I formerly worked at Capital One, and communication was really important there. There's all sorts of regulatory and compliance reasons where we need to be crystal clear about what we're saying.
Very interesting. So do you find, say at Capital One, it's almost built into the culture then? Like it's just a huge emphasis, like from a technical standpoint, and like you were saying, kind of restrictions, but then it's kind of built into the culture as a result of that. Then
That's right. And I think that's why I say that I don't fully appreciate when I obtained it, because when I obtained it, I was just talking, right?
sure,
And Capital One is not regarded as big tech, not in my circles anyway. It's not considered tier one or FANG or even FANG adjacent. So if you look at the interviewing.io analyses, they're not excelling at the coding rounds, but at communication, they're like better than Google. It's like baffling.
very interesting. That's really cool, and thank you for sharing the data points. Like I think I was saying a little bit earlier, right? I think it's awesome. Like I said in my head, I've kind of figured, this type of data must exist somewhere. But the fact that you're out there kind of being like, hey, like I'm interested in this, obviously, with what you're doing, and being able to do things that are like information or stats based is just awesome. So I really appreciate that. It's one of those things where like I definitely don't carve out time to do it, but it's fascinating to me. So that's super cool.
Me too. I have this background in economics, so I'm constantly wearing the hat. So my approach to how can I add value in my mental model, it's based on my background in economics and research, and I need to provide research and then provide value that way. I'm sure this is a mental model which is wrong in some ways. I'm sure I could be funnier or more entertaining and provide value that way. And frankly, I just don't know how to do it. So I end up falling back to research. And that brings us to the latterly curriculum. So I'm always being asked, how do I break into tech? And my answer was, I would curate the best resources I could find. I would refer people to these documents. Don't repeat yourself. You refer it enough times, you write it down and make a document out of it. We're going to scale
Yep.
ourselves with documentation. And I think you mentioned earlier something about not having original shorts. I don't have really original like code either, right? So I'm like going to Stack Overflow and pulling research from places that I can. So it's a curation approach. And it turns out that there is data on these things. Some of it's original, but much of it's taken from elsewhere. One of the interesting tidbits that's original with me is the prestige rule for coding boot camps. So I found a rule where if you go to coursereport.com, there's a reviews aggregator for coding boot camps. And you can segment the boot camps by the count of reviews and the average rating. And so if you go with a boot camp over 4.25 on average with more than 400 reviews, I wrote a paper, and you can find this on SSRN, where that generates a statistically significant employer perception effect, and that will accelerate your hireability. If you go with high prestige boot camps, it's interesting, but it's not that surprising because we know in university,
right,
high prestige universities have better placement rates. And Nick, I know you work at Microsoft, and I think you can attest to some certifications are better than others. Employers care a lot about the best ones and not so much about the average one.
Yeah, so and what I generally say for like when this comes up, because people will ask, they'll say like, is it possible to get employed if I don't have post-secondary or don't have this or don't have that? And what I generally say is like, is it 100% needed or required? The answer is no, because people can do it without it. But then I say, think about the volume of applicants, right? If you have the exact same skill set as 10 other people, but those 10 other people happen to have either more certifications, even though your skill set's the same, they have different, maybe more prestigious school because you didn't even go to school or something. Even if your skill set's the same, all of a sudden, especially on paper, it just starts to look like there is potentially more value in the other candidates. Does it mean that that's necessarily true? Absolutely not. But when there's a lot of volume and people are going by what's being fed into the system for applicants, like it's really hard to tell people you don't need to do anything. You can just go apply. It's kind of like you should try to think about your competition.
And this is just a brief interruption to remind you that I do have courses available on Dome Train focused on C#. So whether you're interested in getting started in C#, looking for a little bit more of an intermediate course focused on object-oriented programming and some async programming, or are you just looking to update your refactoring skills and see some examples that we can walk through together, you can go ahead and check them out by visiting the links in the description and the comment below. Thanks, and back to the video.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I think you touched on at least 3 key areas. So I'll address these briefly, and then we can circle back and go through them methodically. Because we're sort of talking to them as the topics arise. and that's appropriate. But when it comes to learning in an optimal fashion, you're going to want to do these steps in a certain order.
That makes sense.
One of the things that you mentioned was volume. And when it comes to the job search, in the current economy in particular, the biggest problem that I see is an absence of application volume on the part of people who want to land their first or next programming role. And so I have a rule of thumb that I encourage 80 plus applications per week. And you could go for 100. We have the heuristic, the rule of 100, and there's some reasons for that. One is that if I want to A/B test changes in my resume, I need a bunch of data points to even detect a signal. In practice, I actually don't think you need to exceed 100. I think you can get away with 80. And if you are a currently employed senior, you're going to want to bring that number down and be more selective. But if you are non-senior, if you're pre-senior, or if you're at the senior level like I am, but you're not currently employed, you can ramp that up to 80 or even 100. And there are reasons that this is really useful. That alone is not going to help. You're going to want to do social networking too. And we can get into some of the social networking tips if you want to. But this is one of the major keys of 8 keys that I'd like to get into, Nick. One of them is experiment on your job search.
Right. Okay.
So there's a bunch of data about what works. And a lot of the data is good. And some of the data is contradictory. How could it be that some things work for Nick and they don't work for John? Well, I looked at your LinkedIn. It looks like you're on the West Coast.
That's right.
Believe it or not, conditions in Washington are different than conditions near Washington, D.C., where I am. And so how do you tell what's what for you in particular at the individual level? Just A/B test your own resume. A/B test your own talking points, so your own behavioral interview answers. And that's going to be extremely valuable for individuals that are in the job search currently.
And a quick question on that, because I guess depending on who's watching and listening, right, the number 80, depending on your experience, that might sound like you might say, oh, like I do 80 a day. And some people might say 80, like I've sent out 5 and I feel overwhelmed. So when we talk about this number 80, is this 80 unique companies, or is it potentially, different roles at the same company? Say, for example, you want to apply to Microsoft, you might send an application to 10 different roles at Microsoft that are, of interest to you, or, what are your thoughts on that?
Absolutely. This will vary by company, but if you ask a technical recruiter, most recruiters will advise you not to apply to more than two roles at their company, because it becomes a burden on the recruiting system. And so I follow a rule of 3, and actually there's a 3 by 3. So we're talking about experimenting in the role of 3 by 3. So we're working backwards from the job search, but really we probably want to come back and talk about learning to code first.
Sure. Yeah.
So the 3 by 3 is there are 3 job families that you're going to want to network with. So you go apply, and you should be networking with at least 1, and ideally all 3. That's, of course, the hiring manager related to the role, a technical recruiter at the company, and a fellow developer. There's plenty of things that you can say, and it shouldn't be a game. This should be very authentic. If I were reaching out at Microsoft about a particular role, I might want to know, hey, what programming language are you using? Right. I've used Python, JavaScript, TypeScript. Are you using that on this project? Or do you know about a different team that's hiring that's going to use those? So you can also ask for resume reviews, portfolio reviews, and you also want to try to provide value to them. So if someone's going to review your resume, they're doing you a favor, right? So maybe the lowest effort thing to do is say thank you. And it's amazing how many people won't even say thank you, and how far a simple thank you can go, like a sincere one. So these are the 3 job families. And then also I would limit to 3 or less. I typically go 1 or 2, but you can go up to 3 if you really want to. Maybe you're one of these people on the bubble, like a Python developer who really does have an interest in both engineering and data analysis. Sure. Okay, fine, go ahead. But I would limit it to 3 roles at a particular company. You should have a point of contact for every role, not for every company, for every role, because you might be applying to different teams, right? And then the third thing to do, so the first thing is the job families, the second is 3, and then the third is how often do you follow up? So Nick, if you wanted to apply to Upstart and you say, hey, John, can you refer me? And I go, of course, like, you're great, let me refer you. And then you don't hear back tomorrow, probably I don't want you to bug me tomorrow, right?
Makes sense.
So I advocate for waiting really a week, follow up a week, and then I get the question, "Hey, I applied on Thursday. Does the next Tuesday count as waiting a week because we crossed the weekend?" At
I
least
see. Yeah.
At least do 3 business days. Just give it a week. I understand that we get in a rush, and if you're not employed, you might want to shrink the week.
Right.
So you can shrink it down to 3 business days as long as that's the next week, but give it a week. And then 3 strikes and you're out. If you follow up with them and they don't reply, you can follow up a second time. But if you follow up a second time and they haven't got back to you the third time, just move on. You don't want to waste your time. Your time is too valuable. And let me put my economist hat back on. The opportunity cost of spinning your wheels on one job, it's a bad idea. If you look at the best programmers, and here I don't mean genuinely good programmers, I mean those who are good at coding rounds and passing the technical interview.
Sure.
Which I'm sure you know is very different than the job.
And I know that this is one of the topics that we'll get into at some point. But yes, I've produced content on this because I like to let people know, like, there are different skill sets involved in this kind of stuff. We would love if it was the exact same, but unfortunately, it's not really how it works.
That's right. I would love for it to be the same. And I think there may be some positive indications that they're converging over time, but it's going to be a while. For the time being, they are almost entirely distinct skill sets. And I think that's the right mental model, is you should try to become a good programmer, and then you should intentionally practice the job search skills independent of being a good programmer.
Absolutely. Yep.
You should not get hooked on one dream company.
There we go.
You should not get hooked on even one dream company, because even the best programmers have a full loop pass rate of just over 50%.
Wow. These
So,
stats.
yeah. And there are plenty of programmers at Google and at Facebook who will tell you to your face, if I were interviewed right now, I would flunk. It takes time to get prepared properly. You can set your heart on a FANG company. I think that's fine. But you're probably not going to get the job this time around. So be prepared to go somewhere else for now, and be prepared to pursue that over a number of years. So typical cooldown periods will be 6 to 18 months. If you do a really, really good job, ask your recruiter. They might tell you, you don't have a cooldown because you were on the border. So feel free to apply again. That's kind of rare, but it happens. Ask your recruiter. But if you go with the statistics, and if you say, well, my full loop pass rate is about 50%, then that means if they're independent trials, the second time passing either would be 75. Or another way to look at that is there is a significant chance that you're still not getting that job after 3 loops in their cooldown.
Right. Yeah.
So I think that's perfectly fine, and in some ways even admirable for you to stick with this goal of a FANG company over a number of years. But what are you doing in the meantime? And there is a wrong answer to this. And the wrong answer is, in the meantime, I'm unemployed.
Right. Yep, that makes a lot of sense. And I think, just to add on to that, I agree that I think it's great if people have goals where they want to end up, and it's not for me or anyone to say it's a good or bad goal. If that's what people want to do in their career, in their life, like, that's great. Like, set your sights on something. But the reality is that our careers are not like, it's not like a 2-year career or a 3-year career. Our careers are, I mean, if we're planning on staying employed, like, they're for a large majority of the rest of our lives. So if you don't get it right away, it doesn't mean like you're a failure. It doesn't mean like it's never going to happen, but you need to be doing something, unless for some reason you happen to have tons of extra resources and you don't have to work and you can just code on your own until, the next time you want to apply. I'm assuming that's probably not the case for almost everyone. So yeah, I think moving ahead and then going, sure, like, that is my goal, I want to revisit it, and trying again. I think that makes a lot of sense.
Great. So maybe we should go back to, how do we
Yeah.
actually learn to code?
Yeah, I think that would be awesome.
So my starting point here, I think, as I mentioned, is the research on hireability. I basically work backwards from what do employers want. And if we work backwards from what do employers want, there's different ways to analyze this, but I'm trying to take a risk-averse approach that works for most people.
Fair.
Other people will give you advice targeted specifically to landing the best roles, and by best, they mean highest compensation. That's not what I'm trying to do. I think that's a separate conversation, and I think it's a good one to have as a second stage.
I think that makes sense.
As I said earlier, in the meantime, let's not be unemployed.
Right.
So the first thing that I like to do is help people get either a tier 2 or a tier 3 job. And what do I mean by this? You know, people have used these terms in various ways. When I say a tier 1 company, I'm thinking of FANG or FANG adjacent companies. And when I say a FANG adjacent company, I'm referring to the compensation structure and the interview pattern, and then also the skill matrices and other things like that. But most relevantly, how do they run their interviews?
Right.
With a tier 2 company, the compensation will be significantly less, but you will still know these companies. They're household names. Capital One is a tier 2 company. I think I mentioned them earlier. Your chain stores, your Walmart, the stores that the companies that you know, they may be national or international, but they're not competitive with a Google or a Meta salary. And then a tier 3 company, by a tier 3 company, I simply mean a company that isn't well known. They're not a household name. This could be a local web development agency in your county or something like that.
Sure.
And so the vast majority of jobs by quantity exist in those tier 2 and tier 3 categories. It also so happens that those tier 2 and tier 3 categories are on average easier to obtain and don't require leak code. They don't require jumping through these really difficult hoops, and these hoops that are constructed with the intention of being difficult because they're a filtering mechanism for the company. So I essentially advocate that people try to get competency here. And hey, some people will get competency here so quick that they can have the FANG conversation within a month. And
Sure.
maybe it doesn't make sense for them to land a job and leave in a month. So they just compress the job search and they effectively do 2 hops right out of their college degree. Power to them. And actually, that's an important differentiator, is whether you went to college or not. But basically, the approach here is, what do these tier 2 and tier 3 companies want? And the big answer is they want websites. The big answer is they want websites. And what kind of websites do they want? Well, all kinds of them. I think maybe last I checked, WordPress was still the most popular provider.
Wow, I don't know if I guess I'm surprised by that, but now that I'm saying that out loud, I'm like, am I surprised? Like, maybe I shouldn't be. Yeah.
It will depend how you cut up the numbers. So if you look at the numbers of websites themselves, I think it's still WordPress. But if you look at maybe like stores, like, those are not mostly WordPress.
Okay.
So website versus revenue generating official corporate website, you can cut that up different ways. And so if you ask yourself the question, well, what skill set should I learn to make a website? There's a common denominator here, which is HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. And then you can broaden significantly and very significantly improve your job search performance by going full stack and learning the back end as well. And so that's my mental model. And that's the reason that Latterly takes this evidence-based approach of suggesting starting with full stack and then sort of going wherever you want from there. There are some specializations we can talk about, mobile and things like this. I see specialization as a second stage after getting that core of full stack.
That makes a lot of sense. And one thing that kind of comes to mind is, like, especially when we talk about these tiers of companies, I think the way that you laid that out makes a lot of sense. Your approach for saying, like, what do most of these companies look for? Yeah, websites, again, makes sense. So the languages and the tech stacks that you start to look at, totally. Like, you're kind of matching up, like, if I'm going to start investing my time, what's going to give me the best chance of success for matching up with the majority of companies? And one thing that I think, and I don't have stats on this is an anecdote, but if I had to guess at, like, companies, say, like, I'm at Microsoft, for example, I work in the Office 365 part, almost nothing I see has to do with front-end development. And I don't know, you're smiling and nodding, so you might actually have some stats on this, and I don't want to put you on the spot to dig it up or something like that, but is there a big discrepancy when you start to go from what you're classifying as tier 2 and tier 3 to tier 1 in terms of those skill sets? Because, again, anecdotally for me, it's like everything is back end. Like, I'm working on a team that's doing routing for trillions of requests per day. There's no CSS and JavaScript. Like, it's not anywhere near where we're at. I'm not saying that's bad or anything. It's just, it's very different. So do you see a pattern with those types of skill sets and languages?
Absolutely. I love this observation. And I'm laughing because at Upstart, I lead the Python guild. And
Okay.
so I've done zero HTML and CSS myself in the corporate world for years. I still do this with side projects, but I'm a full-time backend developer in the corporate world as well. And the answer is yes. The mix of job family between tier 1 and tier 2 is significantly different. And in particular, it's different in the direction that backend developers are disproportionately highly employed in tier 1.
Okay, interesting. That's like, again, anecdote for me, but I'm like, you probably have some information on this, so that's pretty cool. Awesome.
Yeah, and
Okay.
there's a bit of a puzzle here, but we've given away the answer, but I'll spell out the puzzle anyway, which
Sorry.
is if the full stack developer is able to do back end, front end, and even integrate between them, and then a really cool full stack developer will have some SQL skills and can even do some fun things with data, why would you pay more for a back end developer instead of a full stack developer who can do everything?
Sure.
And in tier 2 and in tier 3, we see a bunch of these like full stack developers or relatively more front end developers, although not absolutely more on a per company basis. Absolutely more across the market, but not absolutely more on a per company basis. The answer is specialization. The answer is specialization. So when you accrue enough capital, you can pay for specialized roles. Those specialized individual contributors have higher productivity along the margin of their specialization. And so one backend developer by themselves doesn't really help a company, but if you're at the point where you can afford teams, it becomes a brilliant choice.
Interesting. Yeah, so like the composition of teams, when you're able to scale up higher, you can do more creative things. I've seen a little bit of that too. Again, like where I'm at right now, it only makes sense to have like we're all back end, but to give you an example, like some of the stuff that we're building, like Microsoft is tons of C# code as one might expect, but some of the stuff we're doing is extremely performance critical. So there's some stuff being built in Rust, and like, okay, like would it, does it make sense to go say we need to hire experts in Rust? Like, yeah, like if we can afford to do that, have that composition mixed into the team, there's still back end developers, but different skill set with Rust coming into the picture and that kind of thing. So yeah, I think that's a good point, that you can afford these optimizations within teams.
And you can afford them because of the scale, precisely because of the scale. So it's not coincidental that tier 1 is where these things occur. In a tier 1 company, when I have tens of thousands of headcount and billions in revenue, if I can have a 1% advantage over my competitor, I can significantly impact the market.
Right.
If my product is 1% faster, I might take 10% market share, which would be millions or billions of dollars. So it's it's a fundamentally different game from a business perspective compared to tier 2 and tier 3.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I love the data being brought into it, because a lot of the time when these discussions happen, I think I've had similar themes of conversations, but it's almost like, yeah, this is kind of what feels right based on experience or my, observed time in industry. But like, here's data. Like, this is cool.
Yeah, so we learned full stack. And then to your point, if you get down the road in your career, it makes a lot of sense to strengthen up on the back end and then maybe go all in on back end. And in fact, that's my story. But let's say that we're visiting that time where I want to learn full stack. Well, how do I do it?
Right.
So one of the keys here is that I want to say there are prerequisites to coding. Sometimes I'm asked, can anyone learn to code? And I want to say yes, but the answer is no. I have 2 young children. They're wonderful. One of them is 3. She cannot read and write. She cannot code. So there are prerequisites to coding, including literacy and numeracy. Anyone who is familiar with the concept of a variable calculation will probably need to know algebra, because 1 plus x equals 3. X is essentially a variable. When I'm solving for a variable, this is an arithmetic operation. So when I say literacy and numeracy, I don't just mean your arithmetic tables, like we're talking up to the level of algebra. Most of us don't need to know geometry, except some of those funny graphics people.
Yeah.
Once you have basic literacy and numeracy, I want to harp on the value of search. And so this is me putting back on my PhD hat, and it's my past bias, and I'll own it. but I believe all other skills are downstream of search. And when I say search, you can also you can group search and research together. I'm talking about both things. And just ask your friends who may know about programming, where did they go to learn to program? Some might say school, but many will say, if you ask them about a concrete problem, they'll say Stack Overflow.
Right.
Or they might say CSStricks.com, or they might say Mozilla, or they might give you a concrete reference. So they have built a mental list of curated resources. And these are basically search techniques: the ability to Google keyword search, the ability to have a known and trusted list of information providers, referring to official documentation. Here in 2024, using generative AI in lieu of Google search. So being able to prompt engineer. And there are some additional ones: guess and check, with a bit of debugging and troubleshooting, knowing how to log, knowing how to place a breakpoint. You can view this as a search technique. So guess and check is a search or research, if that makes more sense to you. If you say, well, guess and check isn't search, but it's a research technique.
Right.
And so I've listed 5 in the laterally checklist. Search is like the second thing we do. There's a video. There's actually like 8 of these. Another one is phone a friend. If you ever saw Who Wants to Be a Millionaire?
Right. Yeah.
You can phone a friend. And there's a way to do these, right? There's a proper way to phone a friend. So you won't want to be the junior who's nagging on the senior without doing any of your own homework. You're going to want to do techniques like try to do some of these other search techniques on your own, apply time boxing, escalate and prioritize when and if appropriate. So there are these 8 techniques. They're not co-equal. It's possible. I will see many students will get stuck and they'll say, well, there's 8 search techniques. Which one do? I don't know which to do. And they'll just sort of sit there and they'll be stuck. Do a random draw is better than doing nothing.
Do nothing. Yep.
But you can do better than a random draw. You can actually rank these. And so phone a friend would not be the first one to do, by way of example.
Right. Which is interesting. The phone a friend part, if I had to guess, based on some of my experience with really junior developers, it's either, now that we're remote, I feel like a lot of people don't want to phone a friend, first of all. But when it was in office, and I don't know if this is exactly related, I think it is a little bit, but what I used to observe is that people would lean on phoning a friend very often. And the challenge with that, it's kind of on 2 sides, is one, you phone a friend, you get the answer. You didn't actually have any of the struggle or like genuinely the learning process. Like, we need to have a bit of friction and discomfort and try and fail things to be able to learn. And it sucks because I think we all just want like the give me the knowledge thing. I don't want any of the pain, just like make it happen. But you kind of get fed answers and it kind of stifles your learning a bit. And the other side is that other engineers who say are more senior, they end up falling into this pattern of, oh, I'll just give this person the answer so they go away and I can go back to being productive. And then it just becomes a vicious cycle, and this person's now doing 2 jobs and the more junior person's not learning.
I agree. For those who are familiar with growth mindset, we'll know that failure is learning and pain is growth, and that we need some of this discomfort, and you can actually come to learn it as a good thing. I think there's an analogy to testing here, where as a junior, I was terrified to see a failing test. And as a senior, I'm terrified if I never saw a failing test. I need to see it fail. I need to see it fail, and then I want to see it fixed. And I would use an analogy to exercise as well. I think this is pretty common, is you get sore and then your muscles grow. At university, there will be plenty of people who disagree with me because it turns out that the way that you learn concepts is very different than the way you grow a muscle. Fine, they are technically right, but I think for the layperson, this is actually a very useful mental model.
Yeah. I agree with that. Even if the mechanism's not the same, I think it's a good reference point to say, like, hey, like, you know that if you're going and working out and like you are feeling like, fatigued and sore the next day, odds are you're probably making progress. It's just going to take some time, right? So I think that's fair enough. Yeah.
The taking the time point is key as well. So whenever I take on a personal student, which I don't do very often, I do apply a few tests. And so I know that applying tests for admission to programs is controversial. but there's reasons we do it. Companies have a formal interview because we need to filter. One of the very few tests that I apply is for grit. For grit. The Angela Duckworth's personality assessment for grit, which is the perseverance towards long-term goals.
Okay.
And this is a remarkable differentiator. If you're asking yourself, should I become a programmer? Ask yourself whether you wanted to be a programmer last month. And if you see that the answer is toggling between yes and no, maybe don't do it, at least not right now. Or a better way to say that is, if you see that the answer is toggling between yes and no, we can predict that your performance will be lower. It's going to be
interesting.
If you have said, do I want to be a programmer? I've been thinking about this for a year. You should try it right now. You should just go try it. Because the ability to hold on to that long-term goal is one of the best predictors of your success. Like right up there, I think better than intelligence. If not, it's right up there with it.
Yeah, I like that a lot. And something you said earlier about like, can anyone be a programmer? Barring like, I think some very minimum requirements, like in terms of being able to read and physically write code or even speak it to a computer. Like I often say, like I think most people can learn to program, but does that mean that they will enjoy being a software engineer? And I think those are very, very, very different answers. And not only enjoy, like, will you excel at it? Because you might say, yep, I can write code. I can make a script or a program do something. I'm like, okay, that's cool. And like, yeah, you succeeded at programming. But like, do you like problem solving? Are you good at problem solving? Do you have a mindset that you're talking about being resourceful and things like that? Like, if you don't enjoy doing those types of things and like that's not aligned with the skill sets you want to improve, you probably just will not enjoy software engineering. It's not just about like, did I put the code on the screen and does it run? Like, there's so much other stuff that gets added in. And yeah, I think people can build the skills, but if they enjoy it long term, very different.
I agree. So I think my pessimistic answer to can everyone learn to program? The pessimistic answer is no, there's some bare minimum requirements. The optimistic answer, and I think these are both true, I don't think there's a contradiction if you can understand the nuance. The optimistic answer is that the majority of people that want to can. And so if you want to, you probably can.
Yep. I think that's a very fair way to put that. Like, yeah, like if you didn't want to, you actually might technically have the skills to be able to do it. But if you don't want to, you're not going to put in the time, you're not going to put in the effort. And then as a result, you'll never even know if you can. Like, it just won't happen.
There's a third related topic, which is some people think that they don't want to, but if they properly understood programming, they would want to.
Yeah,
and so I think
I love that.
is in the popular culture, now we get into the problem of cultural stereotypes. And I think the cultural stereotypes on programming have been really negative, and they've resulted in a lack of diversity in the industry. And we need diversity for the purpose of innovation.
Absolutely.
What's more important to tech than innovation? And we know that diverse teams and organizations are more innovative. So how can we drive that diversity? That's a question that people have been asking for the past 10 years, and we're getting some answers. By the way, coding bootcamps are an extremely good answer to that.
Interesting.
So coding bootcamp gender diversity at graduate is about 50-50.
Wow. That's very impressive. When this used to come up, not for coding boot camps, but I can remember even being in hiring rounds and stuff at the previous company I was at. And this idea of like, we want to be able to have, say, more women or different, more diversity in our hiring. It was like the challenge was you put out the job pages and stuff, and then we'd even have recruiting events. And the reality is no matter what we tried to do, if the pool of people that we're trying to target is disproportionately more like white males, like it's really hard to say, like, you literally have to start saying these people might be very skilled and we just need to ignore them to go focus on a different group. And that's not to say that there aren't skilled people in the other groups, but like statistically, if one group of people has a higher representation, there's probably going to be more people in that group. So it's really cool to hear that boot camps are starting to change that up. I don't know. Do you know about colleges and universities if like that trend of that is changing as well, or is that still like very much kind of locked in, like mostly dudes?
We might be getting marginal benefits, and in fact, I think we are because of things like scholarships and things like that. but those are marginal benefits. In the traditional computer science 4-year programs, they're still overwhelmingly white and male.
Interesting.
And there is some actual reason to think that there is real cultural problems in some of those programs. That even like endow poor mental models and things like that lead to performance problems later on. And I think one of the ways that you can see this in the traditional pipeline, we might call it, which might take you from a CS degree to tier 1 with the whiteboard interviews, very traditional approach, this concept of competitive programming. And you can see that competitive programmers are not above average engineers, actually. So there's this misleading correlate, basically. And so that's one of those places where an overemphasis on competition can actually be harmful to team dynamics. And so that's just one example where some of the traditional approach is harmful, but I actually don't like to speak against the traditional approach. I think if we can get the new practices right, then the market will crowd out, the old things will just become obsolete over time. And there's some really, really cool things going on with hybrid learning and basically coding boot camps. They're getting a lot of things right. What I would advise employers to do is increase their source quantity from boot camps relative to colleges.
Interesting.
On average, and that's not against all colleges. There are particular colleges that have programs that support diversity. So, take this and apply it with nuance to your organization. But I think on average, if we can have more bootcamp graduates hired, we'll have more diverse teams. I think that's really uncontroversial.
That's very interesting. And again, like you're saying, if you're selecting from altering your sources of people coming in, then you can actually shift the volume of those individuals. That's really cool. I know, sorry, we've been jumping around a lot because this is all super fascinating to me, so thank you. I want to see if we go back, because I'm looking at your list of the 8 items here. I know we kind of talked about the beginning, like the structuring your curriculum, and we talked a little bit about literacy, numeracy, and search, so that's good. We talked a bit about front end to full stack, and you did also talk about this is kind of earlier. I think it might have been out of order, but we talked about this concept of the boot camps themselves. If you're interested in those, going to like a 4.2 and having like over 400 reviews, that actually differentiates you statistically. I think that's fascinating. One thing we haven't talked about that's kind of right after that, though, is like a portfolio. So when I look at this list, I think this is really cool because I think something that comes up a lot, especially when I'm trying to help new software developers, is like, I think if you want to learn to be a software engineer, be better at building things, you need to build things. You like reading stuff is great, watching videos is great, you want to pay for courses and other stuff, great, but if you're not building stuff, in my opinion, almost none of that other stuff matters unless you're doing that. So I wanted to kind of hear about, you're saying 3 to 5 projects, like and there's got to be data to back this up, so I'm really curious to hear like how you kind of came up with this approach.
Absolutely. And your intuition, Nick, is spot on, and the research is with you that every other learning modality is second best to project-based learning. Actually doing the thing, learning by doing, is the most effective transfer into actually learning. I also advocate for learning in public because there are social networking knock-on effects that will benefit you at job search time. And part of learning and building in public means starting your GitHub portfolio from day one. I don't care if you commit a README change. Get it in day one because it demarcates the start of your experience. You can point at your portfolio. You can point at those famous green squares and say, I've been coding for a year, even if you haven't been paid. So the portfolio is incredibly critical for not just employer calibration of quality, because frankly, employers don't pay that much attention to the lines of code. If you get an employer that is interested enough not just to view the top line, but to click into your HTML file and read it, that is already an extremely interested employer. And so even if they find some nitpicks, which they probably will, because even the best of us don't have perfect code in our repositories.
Yep.
When they report some nitpicks to you, tell them thank you for looking.
Yeah.
Don't be concerned that they looked. It's an extremely green flag that they looked. But even if they don't dive into the HTML file, if they looked at the green squares below it all, You're accumulating experience. Okay, so what projects do we build? We look at those coding boot camps. We know that the universities and the boot camps are giving employers what they want. How do we know that? Because that's exactly where they're hiring from today. So let's just ask the question, if we look at the best boot camps, what is their curriculum? What are they teaching? What are they building? The answer is they're building Next.js portfolios. They're building React. And why do they do this? Because it's what employers want. There's that famous line, electrolytes, it's what plants crave. I don't know if you've heard the idiocracy.
I've not heard that. Okay.
Okay. But it's like React is what employers want today at tier 2 and tier 3. Basically, that's the answer. And we know this by investigating the curriculum of boot camps, in particular the boot camps with the highest placement rates. And we also know that simply by scanning job posts. If you go to Indeed.com, there's research on Latterly to pull the 8 best job boards for you. So check out the Latterly blog, and you can even download the spreadsheet, which gives the line item reasons. So those job boards are selected for time efficiency as a job search candidate, basically enabling things like an easy apply without sacrificing your application to interview conversion rate. So the places where you're getting jobs and you're actually getting placed, if you look at these places, the job postings in the web development domain, so restricting it to web development domain for reasons we already talked about. In that domain, there are 3 leading frameworks. They're Angular, React, and Vue. And among those 3, React is the big winner. If you learn React, you can go ahead and apply at the entry level for Vue and Angular roles as well. Because the employer mindset is if you've learned a framework, you can learn another one.
Sure. Yep.
So there are actually more than a dozen job titles that you can apply for once you master this skill set, ranging from UI developer, front-end developer, full-stack developer, React, JavaScript developer, and so on. And basically the way you do this is you do this iteratively. So you don't want to dive directly into React. This is an anti-pattern. And many, many candidates have been rejected because they learned React before they learned JavaScript, for example.
Sure.
And so you want to learn the fundamentals. When we talk about fundamentals, yes, data structures are an important sort of fundamental. But before you learn an abstract data structure, I recommend learning a concrete data structure. And so the stage in which I introduced abstract data structures and leak coding and things like that is when you're moving on to language number 2. And if I realize that a dictionary in Python is like an object in JavaScript, how so is it different? I abstract up to a thing called a hash map. And this is like the perfect time to introduce data structures. But before we introduce the abstracto, let's learn the concreta. And let's build something specific. Okay, so we're going to build something specific with React. What should I build? Maybe let's build something you already know. That way, I can hold the business domain constant. I can increase your speed of learning because it's something you already know.
I love that. Yeah, that's so good. And I find that when people, because sometimes they'll say, hey, like, you got to build things to get better. And they go, well, what do I build? And I'm like, okay, well, I realize the problem is people are like, how do I build the next Facebook? Like, I can't come up with the next, $1 trillion startup idea. And I'm like, that's not what we're doing here. Like, the goal is you got to learn. And the only way that you're going to do that is by building things. So the fact that you can start to isolate a variable. So for example, pick like anything, any software, like say any website in this case, right, that you've used, just pick something that you can hold constant. And then the rest, like you just focus on part of that. Yeah, I love that.
And I can get more specific. So Latterly in particular recommends that you build a blog.
There you go, yeah.
So circling back to the most popular sort of website is the WordPress blog. So let's build a blog. Not only have you already seen a blog, but when you interview with an employer and they ask you to explain your project, they will immediately know what you mean. Now, how do we address the fact that when they push back, they will push back and they will say this is a boring, common, boilerplate sort of project?
Sure.
We push back in 2 ways. The first way is we say, this isn't cookie cutter, it's personalized to me. And that needs to be true. So in the Latterly curriculum, when you create your blog, you're doing things like theming it according to your personal favorite color. And you're doing things like putting real blog articles that are true questions and discoveries that you had in your learning journey. So you are personalizing your blog. So it's personalized, it's not cookie cutter. And the other thing is that you will make a blog and then you will make a capstone, which is not a blog. And so you will have a portfolio of at least 2 projects we can see that will push back on that. Now, if I have these 2 projects, I have a portfolio. Now I can make a portfolio site. But the other thing is, I didn't want to jump in directly into React, did I? So I wanted to have a vanilla blog and then a full stack Next.js blog. So this is why we recommend in the range of 3 to 5 projects. You want to do vanilla, and then you want to do full stack Next.js. You might want to do an intermediary step where you don't need to worry about learning SQL yet. So there's an option to do a full stack local storage blog, which has mocked authentication. And then the portfolio is also optional, and then the capstone is not optional. So you're going to have 3 required and 2 optional, so 3 to 5.
That's awesome. I wanted to add in that, and maybe I'll see your take on this, but my philosophy when it comes to projects, again, is like, I think that they're learning opportunities. And if someone were to hand me a resume and they had a handful of different projects on them, what I'm not doing personally is going, how impressive, like from like a monetary perspective, is this project? And to be quite honest, if someone was like, I didn't finish that, like, I actually don't care. I just want to be able to have that as a kickoff point to be like, well, this seems cool. It seems like you were interested in something. Tell me what you learned. Like, why did you pick some things? Like, where did you get stuck? Why did you get stuck? What did you try? Like, I just want to talk about that, because to me, that is software engineering. So the fact that something wasn't like completely finished or perfect, I'm like, when's the last time I wrote software in the last 20 plus years that was complete and perfect? The answer is never. So get it working. Even if you're like, I got part of it working, say it was a full stack thing, and you're like, I really couldn't get the front end the way I wanted, or maybe the database has some quirks, like, cool. Like, let's talk about it. I don't care if it's not perfect, personally. That's my kind of take on it.
I'm 100% with you. I think you're highlighting 3 things that are pretty important. One is, in programming, we have a common idiom, which is get it working and then make it work better.
Right.
So anytime you get something working and then you make it work better, if you're able to describe how it was better, you have created a star method entry on your resume, and you have a metric that you can add to your resume. You make the resume pop. You can give a behavioral answer.
I love that.
So make it work and make it work better. This is something that is really important, especially as a senior. At the junior level, I actually agree with you. It's less important to have quantitative metrics on your resume as a junior. If you can just show that I have projects, that will make you stand out from the crowd. If you can show that you built something and then you made it 20% faster, you're in the top 5% of junior developers. Like, junior developers just don't do that.
Right.
The second thing that I think you're highlighting, or maybe this is the third, I guess, depending on how you slice up the bullet points, is the importance of connecting with a developer at social networking time. If I'm going through the traditional resume process where an ATS will scan it, it will get prioritized by keyword density, and then a technical recruiter will review the top slices. The technical recruiter might click on your GitHub link and go, okay, it exists and they have stuff there. Great. They don't have generally, with some exceptions, and there are some surprisingly technical recruiters, but they're rare. In general, they don't have the ability to distinguish what counts as engineering quality.
Okay.
And so for them, they will think it is important that the project works. In their mind, if they click the link and if the site says 404, that's a red flag. Where if something shows up, even if they don't know how it's implemented, well, clearly it works.
Right.
So what you're speaking to is the importance of social networking with a developer who can actually override the recruiter. Because, newsflash, if you have a conversation between 3 people and they're trying to decide on whether to prioritize your resume, one is a hiring manager, one is the top engineer on that hiring manager's team, and the other is the technical recruiter. The least important voice in the room is the technical recruiter.
That's fair, right? Because they're primarily doing the sourcing and kind of that initial funnel, and they're leaning on the others for like basically scoring or grading how others are doing. So yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
And there's a cheat code here. I agree, that makes a lot of sense. And there's a cheat code here. The cheat code is, if you can network with that engineer, which sometimes people will underrate in the interview process. They think, well, networking with the hiring manager and the recruiter is what's going to get me that interview, right? Networking with a senior engineer is a cheat code, because if you can get them to look at your portfolio they're going to tell you something is wrong with it. They are a senior engineer, and even if you're a senior engineer, senior to senior, they're still telling me something is wrong with it. And
Right.
here's where the cheat code happens. You say thank you and fix it. Now your resume is the top resume in consideration for that team, because you've shown that you're coachable, you've shown that you are like appreciative, and the social capital there is extremely valuable.
Well, okay, and this might lead to, I think I got time for one more thing on your list, because I think we touched on a couple of the end ones, 7 and 8 in the beginning, but number 6 is really like right on this point, I think. So coding round and then behavioral prep. So what you had just mentioned was something about being coachable. And the last thing that I kind of want to dive into a little bit here is like talked about building technical skills, how you're going to be looking at your projects. When it comes to interviewing, and well, software engineering in general, this is one thing that I think does translate very well between the two, is like softer skills. And I sometimes don't like saying soft skills. I'm trying to just call them human skills now, because I think these are things that we just should be doing as humans. And one of them, say, is communication, right? Like, I'm curious, when we go through a list like this and we're trying to prioritize, how we can land jobs, how we can make sure we're doing good as software engineers, how do you layer in what might be considered more soft skills? I heard you say coachability, right? Like, that's a really awesome one. Where does that kind of fit in here?
It's precisely showing coachability and showing soft skills, which makes you such a high quality candidate and a differentiated candidate in the scenario we just went through. In the research on post-secondary alternative credentials and employers' attitudes on those credentials, the single biggest variation, skill gap, is in soft skills between traditionally educated and alternatively educated individuals. So there's this hot debate. Who's the better coder, the coding bootcamp grad or the CS grad? And people talk about this all the time. The truth is that they're both quite good. And they're both terrible with soft skills. So if you can demonstrate that you have soft skill in addition to either a degree or being a bootcamp grad, if you can also show that you have soft skills, you have rocketed up your perceived value in the eyes of the employer to the top of the stack.
And this is perfect, because I want to pause, because I've been saying this and I don't have data, and I know you're the data guy. So this is perfect. Now I'm going to cut this into shorts and post only this for the rest of eternity and say, look, you need soft skills. That is your differentiator. You need to do this.
That's right. And you can look up, I believe it's in the Journal of Economics Letters, if I'm remembering that right. The paper is something like preliminary attitudinal trends. Oh, I'll have to get you the proper. Can I take 2 seconds and look at it?
Yeah, for sure.
So it's the Journal of Applied Economics Letters, Preliminary Attitudinal Trends in Alternative Post-Secondary Learning is where you can go to see the measuring of the skill gap. That is the difference between bootcamp grads and traditionally educated in the eyes of employers. What are those gaps? There's a reason that computer science programs include team projects. It feeds these behavioral interview answers. If you're able to say, well, I haven't done any professional work, but I worked on this team, we overcame this obstacle, we delivered this goal. And so I've been an advocate for building in public and learning in public. I'm also an advocate for social learning. So we talked about project-based learning. There's also the concept of social learning and social emotional learning. If you can build in these components, you will learn better. It will form stronger connections in your mind. You'll actually learn the material better. And it will also prepare you for a behavioral interview, where if you have a hackathon team, you can speak about that as a junior. And so I think these are perfectly good behavioral answers at the junior level.
That's awesome. Yeah, and like I said, thank you for sharing that part, because as you know, I am a software engineer at heart, but I've been an engineering manager for, I don't know, like 12 or so years now. And sometimes I feel like I'm saying this out loud and people are like, oh, like whatever, like that's just, I don't know, like you're an engineering manager, you have a different perspective on it and you don't relate to software engineers. But I'm like, man, like, no, like as a software engineer working with other software engineers, communication, teamwork, collaboration, all that stuff made a world of difference. And when I'm managing people and hiring people, like these are things, like a lot of the technical skills, I'm like, man, if someone's got the right attitude, they want to learn, they're demonstrating all these other things, I'm like, I'm happy to teach them. Like, I will invest my own personal time because I can see that they're motivated to do it. So a lot of these other things I think make a huge difference. But that's awesome.
Well, thanks for having me on here. It's been great to talk to you. Hope we can
Cool.
do
No,
it again sometime.
yeah, I really appreciate the time. So, John, I know you were kind of saying TikTok is your number one spot. Where else can people find you at?
Well, GitHub,
GitHub?
github.com/Vandivier. And then that will give you a link to my other social from there. The other major platform that I stream on constantly would be YouTube.
Cool.
So TikTok will be great for my shorter form material. But if you want to see any of the live coding streams, whether it's open source development or doing some of these algorithm problems, that's saved on YouTube. And there's a bunch of YouTube playlists with saved older episodes as well.
Perfect. Well, John, thank you so much. I would love to have more conversations in the future and find other ways to collaborate. This is totally cool. I love all the data, and I think that's something for me that I'm probably missing in a lot of the things that I'm trying to educate on. So just wanted to say thanks again because this was awesome.
Good to see you.